Sarah Yarborough was a 16-year-old high school student living in Federal Way, Washington in 1991. She attended Federal Way High School and was involved in school activities, including the drill team. On the morning of December 14, 1991, she left her home to go to the school for drill team practice, which was scheduled before regular school hours. She walked to campus as she normally did. At approximately 7:30 a.m., another student arriving at the school discovered Sarah lying near the school grounds. Emergency responders were called, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators determined that she had been attacked shortly after arriving on campus. The location of the assault was outside near a portable classroom area on the school property. The King County medical examiner conducted an autopsy. The examination determined that Sarah Yarborough had died from multiple stab wounds. The injuries indicated a violent attack with a sharp instrument. There were also signs of a struggle. Investigators concluded that the attack occurred outdoors and that the victim had been targeted or encountered by the assailant on the school grounds that morning. The Federal Way Police Department initiated a homicide investigation immediately. Detectives secured the crime scene, collected physical evidence, and interviewed students, staff, and nearby residents. Because the crime occurred on school property and involved a juvenile victim, the case drew significant public attention. Authorities sought information about anyone seen in the area early that morning. During the initial investigation, police collected biological evidence from the victim's clothing and body. This evidence included samples that were preserved for forensic testing. In 1991, DNA technology was still developing, and while testing was conducted, it did not immediately identify a suspect. Investigators also canvassed neighborhoods surrounding the school to identify witnesses who might have observed suspicious persons or vehicles. Over the following months, detectives interviewed numerous individuals and pursued multiple leads. Several persons of interest were identified, but none could be conclusively linked to the crime based on available evidence at the time. The case eventually became classified as a cold case when investigative avenues were exhausted without an arrest. In the years after the homicide, advances in forensic science allowed authorities to re-examine the biological evidence collected from the crime scene. DNA profiles developed from the preserved samples indicated the presence of an unknown male. This profile was entered into law enforcement databases, including the Combined DNA Index System, known as CODES. Despite periodic searches, no match was identified for many years. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the Federal Way Police Department continued to review the case. Detectives maintained contact with the victim's family and periodically revisited evidence as new forensic techniques became available. The case remained open, and law enforcement officials publicly stated they would continue working toward identifying the perpetrator. In 2013, investigators partnered with the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory to conduct more advanced DNA testing. This analysis confirmed that a male DNA profile obtained from the crime scene was suitable for comparison against offender databases. However, no direct match was found in CODES at that time, indicating that the individual responsible had not been previously convicted of a qualifying offense requiring DNA submission. By the late 2010s, law enforcement agencies across the United States increasingly began using forensic genetic genealogy to solve cold cases. This method involves comparing crime scene DNA with profiles voluntarily submitted to public genealogy databases to identify potential relatives of an unknown suspect. Detectives in the Yarborough case pursued this approach. In 2019, Federal Way Police, in cooperation with the Washington State Patrol and forensic specialists, submitted the DNA profile for genetic genealogy analysis. Genealogists identified individuals who shared genetic similarities with the unknown profile, indicating possible distant familial relationships. Investigators then constructed family trees to narrow down potential suspects based on age, geographic location, and other factors. This process led detectives to identify a potential suspect named Gary Leon Hartman. Hartman lived in Washington state at the time of the murder and had no prior convictions that would have placed his DNA in criminal databases. Investigators conducted surveillance to obtain a reference DNA sample from Hartman. In 2018, detectives collected items he had discarded in public, including materials that could contain biological traces such as saliva. Laboratory testing compared Hartman's DNA with the profile obtained from the crime scene. The analysis showed a match, indicating that the same individual whose DNA was found on Sarah Yarborough was Gary Leon Hartman. Based on this evidence, law enforcement obtained a warrant for his arrest. In May 2018, Gary Leon Hartman was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At the time of his arrest, he was in his mid-60s and residing in Washington state. Prosecutors stated the DNA evidence linked him directly to the crime. Authorities also reported that Hartman had been questioned during the original investigation in the early 1990s, but had not been identified as a suspect at that time. Court proceedings began after his arrest. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, including the DNA match, as well as testimony regarding the collection and preservation of evidence from 1991. The defense challenged aspects of the investigation, including the reliability of genetic genealogy methods and the handling of evidence over the decades. In 2022, after a trial in King County Superior Court, Gary Leon Hartman was found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury determined that the evidence established his responsibility for the killing of Sarah Yarborough. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term under Washington state law, effectively ensuring incarceration for the remainder of his life. Following the conviction, officials stated that the case demonstrated the value of preserving physical evidence and applying new forensic techniques to unsolved crimes. The identification of Hartman more than 27 years after the murder provided resolution to a case that had remained unsolved for decades. The Federal Way Police Department acknowledged the efforts of multiple agencies and forensic specialists involved in solving the case. They emphasized that the successful prosecution relied heavily on DNA evidence collected at the time of the crime and preserved for future testing. Sarah Yarborough's death remains documented in Washington state criminal records as a resolved homicide. Authorities continue to encourage the preservation of evidence in unsolved cases, as advances in forensic science may provide answers even decades later.
On the evening of June 2, 1984, 58-year-old Carol Reiff left her home in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, to attend church services. She was a longtime resident of the area and well known in her community. When she did not return home that night, her family became concerned and contacted authorities. Her car was later found parked at the church, indicating that she had arrived but never made it back to her residence. Investigators began searching the surrounding area. The next day, Carol Reiff's body was discovered in a nearby rural location not far from the church. She had been assaulted and killed. The exact details of the attack were not publicly released, but authorities confirmed that the death was a homicide. Evidence was collected from the scene, including forensic samples that at the time could not be conclusively analyzed using the technology available in 1984. Police interviewed church members, neighbors, and individuals who had been in the area that evening. No immediate suspects were identified. Investigators also examined Carol Reiff's personal life and background to determine whether she had known enemies or had received threats. Nothing significant emerged that would explain why she had been targeted. The case remained active for several months. Leads were pursued, and tips from the public were evaluated, but none resulted in an arrest. Without witnesses or a clear suspect, the investigation slowed. Eventually, the case went cold. Over the following years, law enforcement periodically reviewed the file. Advances in forensic science, particularly DNA testing, offered new possibilities. Evidence collected from the crime scene was preserved, allowing future investigators to re-examine it using updated methods. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, DNA analysis began to play a larger role in cold case investigations across the United States. Samples from Carol Reiff's case were tested, producing a genetic profile of an unknown male. That profile was entered into national databases, but no immediate match was found. For many years, the case remained unsolved. Carol Reiff's family continued to seek answers, and investigators maintained that the homicide had not been forgotten. Periodic media coverage helped keep public awareness alive. In the 2010s, a newer technique known as genetic genealogy became available to law enforcement. This method involves comparing crime scene DNA to profiles in public genealogical databases to identify potential relatives of the unknown suspect. From there, investigators can build family trees and narrow down possible individuals. Authorities revisited the DNA evidence from the Reiff case and developed a more detailed profile suitable for genealogical comparison. After analyzing potential familial connections, investigators identified a man who had lived in the area at the time of the murder as a person of interest. Surveillance was conducted to obtain a current DNA sample from this individual without alerting him. Once collected, the sample was tested and compared to the DNA recovered from the crime scene in 1984. The results indicated a match. In 2022, nearly 38 years after the killing, authorities arrested the suspect. He was charged with homicide in connection with Carol Reiff's death. According to investigators, he had no prior criminal convictions that would have placed his DNA in earlier law enforcement databases, which is why the case had remained unsolved for decades. Prosecutors stated that the case relied heavily on forensic evidence rather than eyewitness testimony. The preserved DNA samples and modern testing methods were central to identifying the suspect. Additional investigative work was conducted to reconstruct his whereabouts in 1984 and confirm that he had access to the area where the crime occurred. The arrest brought renewed attention to the case and provided long-awaited answers to Carol Reiff's family. Law enforcement officials emphasized that advancements in technology continue to solve crimes that were once considered impossible to resolve. Court proceedings began following the arrest. The suspect faced charges of criminal homicide and related offenses. Legal processes included hearings, evidence review, and motions regarding the admissibility of genetic genealogy techniques. Throughout the investigation and prosecution, authorities maintained that the evidence indicated a single offender and that there was no indication of broader involvement by others. Officials also confirmed that there was no known prior connection between Carol Reiff and the accused. The case highlighted the importance of preserving evidence in violent crime investigations. Items collected in 1984 had been carefully stored for decades, allowing modern forensic science to be applied when it became available. Carol Reiff was remembered by friends and family as a devoted churchgoer and community member. Her death had a lasting impact on those who knew her, and the long delay in solving the case underscored the challenges faced by investigators before the development of advanced DNA techniques. Authorities reiterated that cold cases remain open as long as evidence exists and technological progress continues to provide new investigative opportunities. The resolution of the Reiff case demonstrated how older crimes can be revisited with modern tools to identify suspects who could previously be not linked to the evidence. After the arrest, officials expressed hope that other unsolved cases might also benefit from similar methods. Genetic genealogy has since been used in numerous investigations across the country, leading to arrests in crimes dating back decades. Carol Reiff's case transitioned from an unsolved homicide to an active prosecution after nearly 40 years. The outcome served as an example of how persistence, evidence preservation, and scientific advancement can eventually lead to accountability. Her family stated that the identification of a suspect provided a measure of closure, even after many years. The case remains a reminder that unresolved crimes continue to affect families and communities long after the initial investigation ends. Law enforcement agencies involved in the case reaffirmed their commitment to reviewing unsolved homicides and pursuing justice whenever new evidence or techniques become available.